All right, let's make a start. Kōrehi te manu takiri mai te ata ka ao ka awatea tihe moriora. Ko tararua te maunga, ko manawatu te awa, ko papaoe te papakainga no atatahi ahau. Ko Alan Hill tako ingoa. Ko Ahorangi Sustainable Practice at Ara Institute of Canterbury. Tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this SDG 101 workshop. I was trying to mihi and admit people into the Zoom room at the same time. I'm still doing that. I get these little flash ups when people are coming in. So we've still got a few people joining us, which is fantastic. As I just noted there, I lead our sustainable practice program at Ara Institute of Canterbury. It's the Polytech here in Aotearoa, Christchurch, and I'm part of the working group who've been putting together the summit series. And for my sins, I was roped into running an SDG 101 workshop. Now, the purpose of this workshop really is to kind of give a bit of a background to the SDGs. For people who may be less familiar with them. And we're gonna, the flow of this workshop is we're gonna actually use a couple of breakout rooms. I'm gonna get you into breakout rooms really shortly to have some conversations with each other. And then I'm gonna use a bit of a PowerPoint to talk through some of the history of how we got to Agenda 2030, which underpins the SDGs and some of the information around the SDGs there. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the reports in terms of our progress in Aotearoa, New Zealand towards the SDGs. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time back in breakout rooms looking at a neat little resource put together by the United Nations called the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. And it's some really simple stuff around taking action on the SDGs. So that's kind of the plan for this evening. Great that many of you have got your cameras on. That's great. If you haven't, that's fine as well. Please use the chat function throughout. Kirsty Hernan, who is going to be our chat monitor or chat host, who's also one of our working group from Lincoln University. Kia ora, Kirsty. So she'll be monitoring the chat and we'll be able to put a bit of a synthesis together of the chat function. So look, what we're going to do is get straight into a breakout room of about 5 people per room. And in that room, I want you to have, we're only going to go short, probably about 4 minutes. And in that room, I want you to have a conversation about your vision for 2030. All right. So this is, the SDGs is all about a vision for the world for 2030. Have a conversation for, in terms of practically, what would you like the world to look like in 2030? All right, have a conversation about that. You might pick up 1 or 2 things to bring back to the group. When we come back, I'm going to ask for 3 volunteers to do a really quick fire share of something that came up in your group. So I'm going to break us into 9 breakout rooms. It's going to be roughly about 5 people per room. And those rooms are opened up now, so you'll get a thing come up on your screen, just accept it and you'll go into those rooms. Okay, kia ora koutou, welcome back.
Are you recording, Alan?
Yes, thank you. I put the recording back on. Thanks for the reminder. Just want 3 people to share the first. So using the reactions function, if you use the clapping hand, the first 3 people to put that up and just to share a quick thought with us from your group conversation. Daniel.
Very generous of me. Yeah, look, I just thought we had a great conversation. And 4 minutes went really fast. We got off to a slow start. It was a big question you asked, Alan. The easy one to start with. I think we talked a little bit about green employment, basically in sustainable employment options. We talked about a fairer distribution of wealth, across organisations. Sort of a normalisation of a more realistic wage for everybody, and probably sharing of wealth. We talked a little bit about. I talked a little bit about my children. You know them, Ellen, and we talked about making sure that there's a world where they could make a contribution by 2030, and we're empowered to do so. My assumption is they're already more aware of what's going on in the world than I would have been at their age, and already passionate about making a contribution. We talked a bit about looking at things from all angles and ensuring that we don't polarize through titles like gas guzzler and rich CEO and things like that, and we need to find a way to incorporate everybody into the solution.
Sounds like a fantastic conversation. Awesome. Thanks for that, Daniel. Joe, I noticed you put your hand up there too.
Yeah, so what our group would like to see in 2030 is a more equal world, so with a smaller wage gap, and like having everyone more focused on well-being rather than like your country's GDP, and everybody collectively being engaged on issues that your community is facing. And then following on from this, we also thought it would be good to have people living in smaller communities with a focus on each other, but then also having those strong connections with other communities, so we're still engaged with everybody.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Joe. And I've got 2 screens of people, so I have to go between them. I didn't see a third hand go up, but now's there's Stuart. Thanks, Stuart.
Yep. We had some good chats. It was a very big goal to talk about in 4 minutes, but we really felt that children, the family unit, no hunger, any third world, let's say, issues within New Zealand were resolved. We did feel that learning from Mother Nature and also learning from our local community, the Maori culture is, the Western ain't working out so well with all the tech, so let's learn from Mother Nature and local. And generally, let's educate people about SDG, because very few people are learning, even on this call. And 2021 should be about education and communication about the goals.
That's great. Thanks for that. Much appreciated. Thanks for those 3 people who were happy to share some of their thoughts, and it sounds like you had some great conversations in those groups. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, and want to just run through, sorry, it always starts at the wrong slide. Run through a quick little PowerPoint with you around just to provide a little bit of background to the Sustainable Development Goals. The name of this workshop is SDG101, kind of that introduction kind of idea. And if some of you are experts in the SDGs, I apologise now for teaching you how to suck eggs, because that's really not my intention. But hopefully we can learn something as we go through here today. So what I want to start with is just a bit of a short history of sustainable development internationally. And in many ways, for me, at the sort of the United Nations level, it goes back to 1948 and post-World War II, which was really the formation of the United Nations in a lot of ways. And in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the Sustainable Development Goals are fundamentally based in human rights framework, and so that's a really crucial piece of the puzzle that we need to keep in mind. It was one of the first kind of big international agreements that had multiple countries signing up to that. Fast forward quite a few years, and we saw the first, or the starting of conferences or meetings of the United Nations, which were focused more around the environment. And 1972 Stockholm Conference on the environment was one of these very early and pivotal events. It's interesting, that was the year I was born, and already people were coming together to talk about the environment and some of the issues that we were facing at that particular time. Fast forward to 1987, the World Commission on Environment and Development And this is really where we started to get some of the first conversations starting around the concept of sustainable development with the Brundtland report. And many of you may be familiar with the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, which talks about development to meet the needs of current generations without compromising those of future generations. It's interesting to note that the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, and in fact the ongoing discourse around sustainable development, is contested. Right? There are people that think sustainable development is a terrible term. There are people that think it's an oxymoron, that you can't have both sustainable and development together. The Brundtland definition has been critiqued for being very anthropocentric or human-centered, and it hasn't taken account of the natural world enough, or natural capital enough. So, you know, these events and these moments in our history are not just straightforward. Some of them are contested, and I think it's important that we remember that. Fast forward again to 1992 and the Rio conference, the Rio Declaration and Agenda 21. So Agenda 21 was a really significant point in terms of advancing both sustainable development and our thinking around protection and resilience of the environment. Moving forward to that, the Millennium Summit in New York in 2000, which resulted in the formation of the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were in many ways the precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals. They tended to focus on developing nations, and they were really about trying to end poverty, to end hunger, to bring better health and well-being outcomes to developing nations. And then we move forward to 2015, which was the UN Sustainable Development Goals in Summit in New York, and that was where Agenda 2030 was developed and ratified, and the Sustainable Development Goals sort of came into being. It's important to know that there's a long history before we got to the Sustainable Development Goals, and some of that history is contested. There's also many events that I haven't spoken about. For example, all the multilateral environmental agreements, things like the Kyoto Protocol, the Montreal Protocol, which banned CFC gases to protect the ozone layer, the Paris Agreement, which we're all familiar with, things like the Declaration on Biodiversity, things like the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So there's a whole bunch of others that could fit into this timeline as well, which are related to the concept of sustainable development. So I want to just spend a few moments talking, if I can, about the ambition of the 2030 agenda. When a lot of people look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they look at the next slide, which I've got on the screen, which is the 17 symbols, and they talk about those things. It's not very often we go back to the actual wording of the 2030 agenda. And I want to read a few bits, and there's some notes on the screen that you'll see, but I want to read some things because I think the language in this agenda, which was adopted by 193 countries, is quite striking. And I find it very compelling, but I also find it worrying in terms of our inability to really grasp hold of the language in the Agenda 2030. So I just want to read a couple of little bits out of the preamble and then on to some of the early articles in the agenda. In the preamble, it says, all countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want to heal and secure our planet. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. And then the preamble goes on to talk about the concepts of people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership, and how important those things are. And then if we get into the starting of the declaration and the articles of the declaration itself, at Article 2, on behalf of the peoples we serve, we have adopted a historic decision on a comprehensive, far-reaching, and people-centered set of universal and transformative goals and targets. It goes on to say some more. Article 3, we resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. We resolve to create conditions for sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, shared prosperity, and decent work for all, taking into account different levels of national development and capacities. Article 5, this agenda of unprecedented scope and significance, it is accepted by all countries and is applicable to all. And then Article 7, in these goals and targets, we are setting out a supremely ambitious and transformational vision. So when I read those, when I read Agenda 2030, I just think it's amazing, the type of language that is there and that so many countries have signed up to it. But I think so often we forget what was signed up to in the declaration, in the agenda. And I think they're really inspiring words for me, but they're also very challenging because at the moment, I don't think we're doing a great job in terms of moving ourselves towards them. So we get to these 17 goals, and we've already had some good conversation from our panelists this evening around those. And I'm not going to go through each of these goals. You know, we understand that there are 163 targets which are associated with the different goals. And we also understand how, you know, Pedram spoke about how this has been put into the context of Aotearoa New Zealand with some of the indicators around the Living Standards Framework. What I do want to highlight here is that the interrelationship between the Sustainable Development Goals is crucial. And there's a little quote here that I've put, and I'm going to give you all a chance to read it. It's a quote from an article that comes out of Nature by Nielsen, Griggs, and Visbeck. And I think it really speaks nicely to how the goals are so interdependent. I'm just going to give you a chance to read it. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second, and we're going to have a bit of a break from the PowerPoint, and we're going to go to the chat function, just to have a check to see if there's any questions that are coming up in the chat. Where's Kirsty?
Nothing specific yet there, Alan.
No questions coming up? Does anyone want to, if anyone's got a question, feel free to just unmute and ask a question now if you've got one around that.
Yes, I'd like to ask about the different nations' approaches, in particular China, who one of the top performers, has very different views on human rights than Western societies have.
Yeah, that's a good point, Gray, and I think Pedram spoke to this nicely in the panel as well, didn't he? That different contexts will have different priorities in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and they may well have quite different interpretations of what they look like. And so if we were to take something like education, for instance, in Aotearoa New Zealand, we have got some issues around equity and equitable related access to education and equitable outcomes, but those are not the same as some parts of the world where, for instance, a young woman don't have any access at all to education. And so those sorts of differences across countries in many ways are related to the context and how the SDGs are are implemented. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and carry on a little bit if I can.
Sorry, may I make continuations of the questions from the previous? And yes. I'm also studying a PhD now about sustainable agri-food value chain transformations in developing countries. And by seeing these very various and each country has their own goals. It means that how we can interrelate across countries in which we are gathered as United Nations. If, for example, my country is Indonesia, we have setting our own goals, our priority. New Zealand has their own priority. And then how we can work together as countries to set this justice distributions and everything. I still don't get it, how it can get across together.
I think that's a great point and a really good question. I think if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals at a whole range of levels, it's very challenging for us. If we boil it down just to the very personal level, for each and every one of us on the Zoom call, we don't live a life true to the SDGs. It's very difficult for us to do that individually. We probably try and do as well as we can in all sorts of different ways. Then if we take our whānau or our family units, perhaps our communities, our workplaces, again, how do we implement the Sustainable Development Goals in those smaller groups? And then we move to a region, like was shared around the Waikato project. If we were to think about Aotearoa, Christchurch, where I live, what might it mean at a regional level? And there are initiatives happening there, but there's still so much work to do. And then we go nationally, and then we go globally. I guess we can see the scale of the challenge ahead of us. The thing that gives me real hope is that 193 countries have signed up to Agenda 2030 and to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have to just start holding our leaders to account who have signed up to those very supremely ambitious goals.
More questions come through on the chat. Alan, do you want to go through some of those now, or after you've gone through more slides?
Look, let me finish off the PowerPoint, and then we'll go back to those questions. Does that sound okay? Can everyone see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so I just want to talk very briefly about some of the reporting that we've got around the SDGs. So we're 5 years in. These were adopted in 2015. We've only got 10 years to go, or less than that now, 9 years to go. And so I want to just look at a couple of different levels. All these reports, Kirsty's got links for all of these. We'll be putting them up in the chat function so you can copy and paste them, and you can get access to all of these reports at both international levels and then at a Aotearoa New Zealand level. So this is these little graphics here. You may not be able to see them, but I just chose 3 examples that have come out of the recent global report on the SDGs for 2020. And you can see already they're starting to put in COVID implications into the SDGs. What I've tried to do here is to choose 3 to show a bit of the diversity across the SDGs. I think the sustainable settlements and cities is a really, so many people live in those environments. I think they're so crucial for us as we move forward to be thinking about those. But you can see here from this global report that it's actually not great reading. We're making some progress in some areas, but COVID has really challenged that in a lot of different ways. And there are still a number of areas where we need to make significantly more progress. I think goal 13 in terms of climate action is a massive issue for us that is becoming increasingly urgent as science is advancing in that area, and as our political will to really take action needs to ramp up. And so if you go through all 17 goals in the global report, the 2020 report, there is some progress, there is some good news, but there is still a lot of, let's say, there is work to be done on many of the goals. here's one of these dashboard indicators, and this is Aotearoa New Zealand. This came out of the 2019 global report, and you can see here that this is from an international perspective, looking in at Aotearoa New Zealand. That really one of the only sustainable development goals where we're doing really well is affordable and clean energy. And whether you like Rob Muldoon or not, building all those big dams on our rivers, we've got some historical legacy around investment in hydroelectricity, and then ongoing investment in geothermal and wind power, which means that a large proportion of our energy comes from renewables, which we're fortunate to have. It's still an area we need to do more on, but we're tracking pretty well. We can also see some areas where we need to do a lot more. Our partnership isn't, we're not doing so well there. We've got some challenges around climate action, and then there's a lot there that is still orange, which means we have some significant challenges. The arrows down the bottom, they're just related to how we're tracking. Are we getting better? Are we kind of going okay, or are we stagnating, or are we getting worse? And there's some areas where we're getting worse. Inequality is one of them, number 10. New Zealand is increasingly becoming one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of income and wealth inequality, which is of real concern. We produce, or there is the opportunity for countries to produce what is called a voluntary national review, a VNR. Here is our one, which was produced in 2019, He Waka Eke Noa. And the VNR for New Zealand really focuses a lot on the living standards framework that Pedram spoke about earlier. And if you go into this report, be prepared for it to be very text heavy, and I find it actually very difficult to find out exactly what our progress is on the goals. I think it has a lot of ambition. It talks a lot about what we want to do and where we want to be, but it doesn't have a lot of actually we're at this point now, and we know we're at this point because we've got this evidence. And I think when Pedram talked about the wellbeing indicators, which are in the Stats New Zealand site, many of those have got no data. I think, what did Pedram say? 48 of the indicators have no data. So that's a bit of an issue. Also produced in 2019 was the People's Report. So this was coordinated and published by Hui, which is a community peak body that represents community organisations. It was co-edited by Moko Morris, and Moko is the co-chair of the SDG stakeholder group with myself. So special mihi to Moko, and to Jill Greer, who's a wonderful woman who's on our stakeholder group as well and has been involved in the Sustainable Development Goals space for a long time. And then there were a lot of contributing authors to the People's Report across a whole range of different organisations. The findings of the People's Report are not quite so rosy as the Voluntary National Review. They're suggesting that the use of the SDGs in Aotearoa New Zealand is really inconsistent, that the progress towards them is very uneven. So they point to some good examples of practice, and I think we've heard about one this evening with the Waikato Wellbeing Project, but also there are some significant issues, and this is particularly true for Māori. We still have major threats to land, water, and marine biodiversity and systems, and we have issues around climate change and lack of really clear links between the living standard frameworks and the SDGs in terms of how they're being implemented. So what I want to do is to stop sharing before we go into the lazy person's guide to saving the planet, and let's come back to some questions, and we're going to spend maybe 5 minutes or so on questions, and then we're going to put you into some breakout rooms around to talk about some of the action that the United Nations suggests in that website. So Kirsty, have we got some questions there?
A couple of the questions. We've got some where we're saying, well, how do we as a small country compared to bigger countries can make a difference? So like when we're doing a lot and larger organisations, countries aren't doing much, how can we influence them?
Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it? And I think this is a question that is often labelled or directed towards climate action. And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is our per capita impact. So if we just take the climate one, for example, per capita, New Zealand is a really high emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. If we compare that to India and China, per capita, they're tiny. They're much, much smaller than us. So it really is beholden on us to do everything we can to work hard towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's not just about leading by example. We've actually benefited from having high resource intensity and being a wealthy nation for more than 100 years. And that has been exploitative in lots of different ways, socially, culturally, and environmentally. And so we actually have a responsibility to turn that around. So, I think sort of pointing to others around the world and saying, oh, we're doing more than them. I think that's kind of missing the point, if I'm honest. I really think we need to be looking at our homes first, looking at Aotearoa New Zealand first, and realizing we need to make some key transformations in our own place.
And I guess Pedram referred to earlier that they'd looked at the 160 odd indicators under the SDGs, and New Zealand have used or focused on 100 of those. And which leads me into the next question, which is what are the priority goals of New Zealand and where are we now in terms of achieving these goals?
Well, I think in some ways that's determined by at a government level by the Living Standards Framework and the wellbeing indicators. And so I'd encourage people to go and have a bit of a look at those. From my perspective, I think, and this is all very well sort of from an academic perspective, but it's really crucial to think about how the goals interrelate. But then, when we want to think about how we actually put them into practice, sometimes we just have to boil things down a bit to make it really, really practical. But it's also about how those actions can then influence other areas, And so I think if we think about waterways, for example, I think if we look at a whole range of different initiatives to be able to improve waterways in the kind of way that Tama was talking about in his talk, and that was an example of a small waterway restoration that has quite large implications at a whole range of different levels. And I know over at Koko Rarata, the runanga over there and their involvement with food production and care of the land and care of the water, so many of those things actually go together really effectively. So for me, I'd be always encouraging people to think about the integration of the goals and how we can work with multiple goals.
Are the goals mandatory, or is it an expectation of the governments that sign up? That's to your earlier comment.
Yeah, so like a lot of things that countries sign up to with the United Nations, they tend to be non-binding. So it's not like we're going to be fined billions of dollars if we don't do certain things. I guess there is an element of good faith in the signing up to the Agenda 2030 and to the Sustainable Development Goals. I think who was it? Was it Pedram that spoke about the concept of accountability and how those sorts of terms can be quite fluid and difficult to pin down. And I think potentially accountability is one of the issues that we have around the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also one of the issues we have around things like the Paris Agreement related to carbon emissions.
Probably the last one here would be a good summary. Marilyn suggested that there are a creative transitions group that are compiling a list of actions that people can take, and organisations or systems are not yet done. But if you are interested in getting involved, maybe put your comments or your email address in the chat so that she can send a link so that you could join in with that group.
Sure. Yep, that sounds great. Kirsty, can you remind me of the run sheet? Because I think we might have just gone over time. What time are we due back in the main room?
We are due back now.
Yeah, okay. Ellen, Corbin is just taking over the presentation again in the main room.
Okay, all right, folks. Well, look, what I'd encourage you to do is to jump onto the UN website to have a look at the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. It has some really interesting stuff around actions at 4 different levels, things you can do personally, things you can do with your family, things you can do in your workplace. Check it out. Sorry that we haven't had time to have a bit more of a conversation around that. If you want to log out now and then log back into the main room for the summary, that would be fantastic. So, Ngā mihi nui, thanks for joining us.